Alright, everybody, hope you're doing well. What I want to do today is go over some of the absolute basics in Adobe Photoshop. I want to talk about how to open a file, how to adjust that image in terms of brightness, contrast, tone. I want to also show you how to crop that image, as well as show you as quickly as I can a few of the basics in navigating the different menus and windows in Photoshop. And finally, I want to show you how to save that file in Photoshop. So obviously you're going to open Adobe Photoshop, and to open a file in Photoshop, simply go to File and choose Open, and then you want to find a file that you want to open. I'm going to recommend this Trees Road image, and you will see that that will instantly pull your image into the overall Photoshop interface. In addition to opening that image, though, you'll see all sorts of things. You'll see some different windows to the right. You will have some different menu tabs: File, Edit, Image, Layer, Type, Select, Filter, 3D, View, Window, and Help. You'll also have some options that go along with primarily the tools that you're using in Photoshop. And then here on the left side of things, you will have your Adobe Photoshop toolbar, which includes a lot of things that we'll use often, like your Move tool, like the rectangular marquee tool. Also things that we won't use very often in this class, things like the blur tool, the dodge tool, and some more everyday options like the horizontal tool and the rectangle tool. To adjust an image in Photoshop, one thing that you want to make sure is open is your layers window. Over here on the right side of my screen, you will see the layers menu is open. And the interface of Photoshop is very customizable, so you're able to make a lot of changes, not only to the image that you're working on or the poster or whatever your project might be, but you're also able to kind of make this space your own. And so if there's an option that I mentioned, like the layers window, and you say, well, I don't want to see that, you could actually go here to Window and choose Layers and hide that, and it will noticeably go away. Or if there's an option that you need to see that I mentioned that's not here, you can go to your Layers window and it will be right there. Now what I want to show you is just a couple of basics in Adobe Photoshop. But one recommendation that I have anytime you're working on a file in Photoshop is to unlock the background layer. Photoshop is all about layers, and I'll talk about that probably in a different video. But to unlock your background layer, you will see that a lot of ways away from where it says background is a little lock, and that's just kind of limiting some of the options that you can do in Photoshop to adjust this image. And we don't want any limits placed on our creativity, so we want to unlock that background layer. It's a good starting point anytime you're opening an image to edit it in Photoshop, is to start by unlocking that background layer. So to do that, we're just going to double click inside that window where it says background. You'll notice that will change automatically to layer 0, and you can hit OK. One thing you can do in Photoshop is you can also rename your layers. So let's say you were working on, a large advertisement. You might have several different layers of text, a background image, maybe a model or an actor or a series of images. You might have some different drawings. You might have a whole bunch of different layers, is what I'm trying to say. And so sometimes instead of those layers being numbered, which is the default in Photoshop, you might want to rename those. All you have to do to rename your layer in Photoshop is just double click where it says layer 0, and you can change that to anything that you want. I'm going to change mine to photo and hit enter. And so suddenly you have an unlocked image that you can do a lot of really interesting things with, and you've customized the name of it. That's a good starting point. If we go up here to the top of our image, we've got File, Edit, and Image. We want to choose the Adjustments tab here, and let's just play around with one of these. But you can do a lot of things in this kind of series of adjustments. You can Add a photo filter to make it warm or maybe cool. You can make your image black and white. You can adjust the color balance. So if your image is a little too red or a little too yellow, you can adjust the amount of each hue that's in there. You can also colorize that image, adjust how saturated it is, adjust things like the exposure of a photograph, adjust the highlights and shadows. But for the sake of simplicity, we can go and choose adjustments and then choose brightness and contrast. Some very simple photo editing that you might be used to using even on your phone or maybe in Instagram or something like that. But it's pretty simple. You've got two main sliders here. One of these is going to be for brightness, and one of these is going to be for contrast. So you can have a low contrast or a very high contrast, a darker image or a brighter image. You can make it so bright you can hardly stand to look at it. You can make it so dark that anyone can hardly see what's going on. But make some kind of small adjustments. And then if you're not sure what to do, one option you have when you're making these adjustments in Photoshop is you have a little preview window here. You can check that box or uncheck that box and it will show you, hey, here's what it used to look like. And then you can check preview and it will show you what your changes look like in the document. You also have the option to automatically correct the brightness and contrast. So if I hit auto, Photoshop will try to make its most educated guess using the software's algorithm. Now I'll be the first to tell you can do auto brightness contrast, auto tone, auto color, auto levels, and sometimes the auto option does a tremendous job. Sometimes it just doesn't. But I think, especially if you're starting out, if you're not sure about your image, it's at least worth checking the auto box, the auto button, if you will, and then you can make some other small adjustments as you go. And if you like the changes you've made in brightness contrast, you can hit OK. If you don't like them, you can hit cancel. I'm going to hit OK. One thing I want to show you how to do very quickly in Photoshop is how to step back in the work that you're using. You can use this with mouse short keys as well. But for example, here on my Mac, I can hit Command Z to undo, or I can go to Edit and choose Undo, and that'll actually take that one step back. You can also redo under that same Edit option. So I know I kind of have a subtle before and after here in my photo, but you can go and undo and redo. The next thing I want to show you is some different tools and options in Photoshop. We have the Move tool, which will do exactly what you would imagine any Move tool does in the history of Move tools. And we have a wide variety of options in Photoshop. We have a selection tool, a lasso tool, a magic wand tool, a crop tool, and so on and so on. Now, one thing that you'll notice about the toolbox or the toolbar, whatever you want to call it, in Photoshop, is you will see kind of a small triangle in the bottom right of each button here on the menu. And if you were to hold your mouse on that button, it will suddenly give you the options to choose some other tools. So, for example, hiding underneath the crop tool is the perspective crop tool, the slice tool, and the slice select tool. Hiding underneath the magic wand tool is the quick selection tool and the object selection tool. Hiding under the rectangular marquee tool is the elliptical marquee tool and two others. Hiding underneath the rectangle tool are 5 other tools. Hiding under the paint bucket tool is, for example, the gradient tool. And so sometimes you'll be looking for an option in Photoshop, whether it's something I'm teaching you or someone else has suggested that you use a tool, or maybe you're just playing around with a design trying to find the tool that you're looking for. And I think it's tempting sometimes to look at this toolbox and say, oh my goodness, my version of Photoshop doesn't even have the elliptical marquee tool. But yes, it does. It's probably just hiding underneath a similar tool. And the reason Adobe did this, made this choice by the way, is so that your toolbar has, roughly about 15 or so buttons visible at a time. It would be kind of insane if the, 40 or 50 options you have for toolbar buttons were all present at the same time. So it's just a nice way to keep your workspace kind of simple. So let's use just one of these for the sake of time today. Let's use the crop tool. And the crop tool, you're used to doing this in perhaps some social media photos that you post. You want to crop the photo, and what that means is obviously you're going to choose what you want to keep and what you want to eliminate from that image, what you want to crop out of it. There's a joke here somewhere about cropping out an X or cropping out somebody in the background, but we're not going to worry about that since we have this photo of trees here for my example. But let's say we want to crop it where this road is kind of at the end of the image. All we have to do with the crop tool is it brings up a nice little rule of thirds for us here, but brings up kind of these different edges, and we can go in and crop that however we see fit. Make the selection that you want to make. And then what you can do in Photoshop is you'll notice it's kind of grayed out the parts of the image that I think I want to crop out. If I decide, oh my goodness, no, I don't want to actually make this kind of crop, I can hit the little no symbol. Or if I like this choice, I can hit enter, or I can click this check mark to commit my current crop selection. And just like that, boom, very simple. I've now taken an image, I have adjusted the brightness and contrast, and I've cropped that image. Now something else you can do very easily in Photoshop is add text to that image. Not surprisingly, you can use the text tool for that. And especially as a lot of you may be new to Adobe Photoshop, what's very handy, not just in the 2020 version of Photoshop, but every version over the past few years that I can recall, if you kind of just let your mouse hover over a certain tool, like in this case my mouse is hovering over the horizontal type tool, it will show up in small text and say the name of the tool. So in case you're not certain what you're clicking on, if you just kind of let your mouse hover and say, oh, is this the eraser tool? Oh, okay, it says it's the eraser tool, I'm good to go. Or the same thing with the text tool. So let's add some text. You notice if you hit the text option, we're going to choose horizontal type, and then we'll notice here at the top of the options bar, since we've selected the text tool, it has adjusted. So all these options are options for the tool we have selected. So these are all options obviously for the text tool. And this is very similar to what you might find in a Word document like Google Docs or Microsoft Word. And so we can change what font we're using. I'm going to choose Georgia font. I'm going to choose the font to be bold. You can choose the point size. So I'm going to make mine 36 point size. You can adjust if it is centered, right aligned. If you want to change the color of your text, it is typically going to be defaulted to black or white. If you click inside this little box, it will bring up what's called the color picker, and this is going to be your friend. This is going to be your buddy in Adobe Photoshop. You'll spend a lot of time with the color picker if you're playing around with Photoshop for any length of time. And let's say that I want to select kind of a dark red color here. And so you can make big adjustments here on the rectangle slider, and then more kind of fine-tune adjustments by clicking inside the square here until you get the color that you want. So let's say that I like this color. Then you've got a couple options when you're playing around in Photoshop. You can simply click your cursor, or you can draw a box. Either one is fine. I simply clicked my cursor here and then type whatever you want to type in that box. So I'm going to type the journey. And let's say that I like it. So I'm going to go up here and hit my check mark, or I can simply hit enter and kind of commit these changes. But let's say I don't really like where that is positioned or how that's positioned. You'll notice by adding this text to my image in Photoshop, I have a new layer here. And so that is simply a new design element that's simply been added to the list. And what you can do in Photoshop is adjust each layer at a time. So I can just move or adjust the photo, or I can just move or adjust or change the text. So let's say I want to move this text. And to do that, you guessed it, I'm going to use the Move tool. So I'm going to select the Move tool. The other thing that you want to do is make sure that your text layer is selected. Then all you have to do is use your Move tool by clicking on your text, and you can move that literally wherever you want within the image. So you can put it literally wherever you want and be done. The last thing I want to show you today before we talk about how to save your file is a lot of times when you're working with text in Photoshop, it is difficult to read, perhaps because you have a complex background or a complex photograph. And one thing you can do in Photoshop is add some effects to the different images, photographs, blocks of text that you're adding. And so here we've got our layer for the journey. You want to make sure again that that's selected. Then if you go to the bottom of the layers menu, you have a little F and a little X. It's supposed to be there to teach you some effects and to allow you to add some effects. Get it? F, X, effects. Add some effects to each individual layer. If we let our mouse hover above that, it says add a layer style, and let's do that. So let's click add a layer style to the journey, and let's choose outer glow. You'll notice this brings up a greater menu. You'll notice our outer glow is selected here in Adobe Photoshop, and we can adjust all sorts of things within this option. We can change the overall spread and distance that the glow effect travels. We can add the overall size of our glow effect. And again, if you're not sure if you like your changes or not, you can always go to this little preview option and turn the preview on and off and say, is that better than the version I had before or not? Obviously, at least it's a little bit more readable here. And so when you like the adjustments that you've made in outer glow, you can hit OK. If you don't like them and you just want to totally start over, you can hit cancel, but I'm going to hit OK. And so suddenly I have a cropped image that includes text and a text effect. You'll notice that not only now does it say the journey here in my layers menu, it has now added a listing for the effects, and in particular for the outer glow effects. And one thing you can do, speaking of previews, is if you click these eyeballs next to, for example, where it says effects, that's kind of your way to preview or unpreview the design choices that you've made. So it's kind of creepy that you see a bunch of eyeballs here on your layers menu. Don't think too much about that, it'll get weird real fast. But it's a nice way to kind of see what it looks like with or without that effect. Or you can also turn individual layers off. So I can see what this photograph looks like with or without my text and effects simply by clicking this eyeball to make this layer suddenly invisible. It's not deleting the layer, it's not making any permanent adjustments, it is simply hiding in a brief kind of preview way the work that you've done. To make that reappear and to be visible, you're just going to click that empty box where the eyeball used to be, and suddenly that layer and any effects that you've made to that layer are visible. Last thing I want to show you today in Adobe Photoshop is how to simply save the file that you've been working on. To do that, not surprisingly, you're going to go to File and choose Save As, but this next part is very, very important. If you're using a more recent version of Adobe Photoshop, especially within the Creative Cloud, it will ask you if you want to save it to the cloud or on your computer. I'm going to choose Save on your computer for now, though you can certainly choose Save to the cloud or not. This will ask you what your file name wants to be, but what's very, very important when you're working with a Photoshop file, because you've got different layers at all times, is you want to preserve those layers. You want to be able to open this file back up 2 weeks from Tuesday and maybe change the text to a different font. And to do that, you've got to preserve the different layers that are in your design. So to do that, you've got to make sure that you first of all save any project that you're working on as a .psd file, and in particular that the format simply says Photoshop. You'll notice it gives you all kinds of different options: PNG and PDFs and JPEGs and bitmap files and TIFF files and all sorts of things. But it's important that we save everything we're doing in Photoshop actually in the Photoshop format first. I can't tell you how many beginning design students that I've taught in my in-seat classes, and they have just saved their poster at the end of maybe an hour's worth of work, and they save it as JPEG. They leave for the day, they come back to our next class meeting, they open the JPEG, and suddenly they can't just move one shape around. They can't just change the size of a text. They can't just fix a typo. Everything kind of becomes flattened and rasterized in one file unless you save it in a Photoshop format first. So you can save it as a JPEG second. You can save it as a PFD second. But anytime you're working in a Photoshop file, because those layers will be crucial to you as you continue through your design process, save it in a Photoshop format first. If you're not sure, it's going to say Photoshop here, it's going to say .psd up here in your file, and it's going to actually say layers, and it's going to be checked mark. That's very important. So you want to hit save. Then you're going to get this pop-up window. It's going to ask you if you want to maximize your compatibility. I think in life, maximizing your compatibilities are a pretty cool thing. Photoshop can teach us a lot about life. But what this teaches us in particular is if you were using a different version of Adobe Photoshop, maybe a version that was 2 years old or 5 years old, if you maximize compatibility, you will be able to open it not just in other applications, but in other older or maybe even more recent versions of Photoshop. So you always want maximized compatibility, I should say, to be checked. You're going to hit OK. And there you go. You've done it. You've saved it as a Photoshop file. Then afterwards, if you want to save it as a different format, again, you can go to Save on your computer, and you can save it. If it's something you want to post online on Twitter or Instagram, or you want to save it as a JPEG so it will load fast in a browser like Google Chrome or Firefox or something, you can save it as a JPEG. But make sure you're always saving things as a PSD Photoshop file first, because that's going to preserve your layers. With that being said, I'm going to save this as treesroad2.jpg. But with that being said, when you go to save a file as a JPEG or as a PNG or as a PDF, you will typically have an option that will pop up and say, what's the resolution that you're looking for? And you want maximum quality for any image that you're saving. I can't imagine why not. So you always want to drag your slider all the way to the right so you have a maximum quality. And for today, we're not going to worry about format options. Standard baseline format is a great format. That's why it's standard. So you can hit OK, and you can save your finished file. Not just as a PSD Photoshop file, but also save it as a JPEG. If you have any questions about Photoshop, There's plenty more to learn, but I hope that gave you at least a decent look into some of the basic tools and techniques you might be using as you work with a file. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk again soon.